What's going on, guys? Ben from JK Gear and Gadgets, and welcome back to another video. I just installed a set of 538 gears and the Yukon zip locker into my Ford Dana 60 axle. This is going into my JK. I've been doing a full 1-ton swap video series. For those of you that are looking for that, check out all the videos step by step on how to put a set of 1-ton axles from the junkyard into your JK. But in this video, we're taking a look at how to re-gear a Dana 60. This can be a pretty complicated process. I know there's not a lot of info online, so I'm hoping this video will help you out. There's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts on this install. So watch the video, do a lot of research, and see if a re-gear is something you want to tackle at home. Luckily, it's not too hard, and with a little bit of research and trial and error, you can knock it out. So let's dive right on into the video. I will say that I'm not quite finished, as you can tell here. The gears and lockers are set up, but I'm waiting on a set of O-rings that I actually lost. But that's a moot point. Wanted to go ahead and get this video out for you guys. So stay tuned, sit back. It's going to be a really long video, but it's going to be very informative. The Dana 60 is very similar to setting up gears on a Dana 44, a Dana 30, and a lot of other axles. So enjoy the video and hope you learned something. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get right down to business. So as you can tell, have the Dana 60 here on the axle stand, and we are ready to put new gears and a locker in it. I'm gonna go ahead and say that if you haven't watched the 14-bolt video, I'd recommend you check that out. Go very far in depth. That's an hour and 20-minute long video. Show you a lot of stuff about pressing on bearings, putting the ring gear on, all that stuff. And in this video, I will be going into detail. I just won't be covering it as much since it's already covered in that video. I don't want this to be another hour-and-a-half long video. I want this to be, quick and helpful for those of you thinking about doing this swap. But so let's talk about my setup. This is a Dana 60 out of a Ford Superduty, 2005 and up. This is from an F250. You can get them from an F350. But once again, definitely do all your research. Make sure you're getting the correct axle and make sure you buy the parts for the correct application. So this is Dana 60 35 spline. So first thing we're gonna do is make sure we have all the parts we need. Of course, we are gonna need new gears. I went with Yukon for all of this stuff, and I included them all Yukon parts in my rear 14-bolt as well. Yukon makes great stuff, goes together really good, and honestly, I'm a big fan of Yukon stuff. So we went with the 538 thick cut gears. Once again, of course, we're gonna have to match our differential gear ratios. And up front, I went with a selectable locker. This is an air locker made by Yukon. It is the zip locker. It's not too crazy expensive. It's a little less than other selectable lockers on the market. And I've heard great things about it. I've never ran one before, but we are going to try this out. This comes with everything you're gonna need. Carrier shims. We have our air hose, our switches and solenoid in there. And of course, our little bulkhead fitting to run the airline through the actual differential. We have everything here. We have the new gears, the locker, and under here is our master install kit with all new bearings, ring gear bolts, everything we're gonna need to assemble this axle. So our first step is going to be to remove our carrier and ring gears. Once again, I would definitely mark it. It's hard to see on the GoPro, but I marked a little L up here. This one's a little easier to see. And a R right there with a bunch of dots. You could do 1 dot up here, 2 dots over there. You just really want to make sure that when we go to put this back together, the carrier bearing caps are in the same orientation as we took them off. So let's go ahead and blast these guys off and really try to remove our ring gear. It's kind of hard to get this guy out of here, but with a breaker bar or something to pry it out, we're gonna make sure it doesn't fall to the ground, but we're going to remove our ring gear and carrier. Make sure you put all this stuff in a nice safe place where you're not gonna lose it. A lot of the stuff we are gonna need to keep. So, since we got this removed, we're not gonna be able to yank this carrier out of there. It's preloaded with shims really tight in there. Like the 14-bolt had those adjusters on the side where we could loosen it. Dana 60 doesn't. Some people get case spreaders, which bolts to this and spreads the actual housing apart to make it easier, but that's an added expense. I didn't feel like buying a case spreader, and it's not exactly, necessary. We're gonna grab a pry bar, I have one over there, and we're gonna pry this out of here. I know some people have a trick to put a rag on the pinion and turn the pinion and it pops right off, but I've had good luck just using a breaker bar and popping this out. There we go. And voila, carrier is removed. We're gonna grab our socket and an impact wrench. This is a inch and 5/16. You're gonna want to get a thin wall socket so it fits here in the yoke. I've already loosened this up before, but normally you hold it with a pipe wrench so your yoke isn't spinning around. But we're gonna loosen and zap this off. Got the old yoke off. We're gonna keep this unless you want to change your yoke out. At this point, you can't simply push the pinion out. You're gonna have to get a brass punch or just hammer it since we're not reusing this pinion, but it's up to you. We're gonna get a little brass punch and pop our pinion out. Go around to the other side and pull it out. Grab our old crush sleeve out of here. Boom, pinion is removed. And as you can tell, pinion bearing, and honestly, this looks like it's in pretty good shape. It's always a good sign. In order to remove all the bearings and baffles and everything, wow, that was way too loud. I said baffles way too loud. Baffles! But no, we are gonna pull off our old pinion seal. We're not gonna keep this, so we're just gonna trash it. I'm gonna grab my hammer and knock this thing out of there. Finally. All right, gonna go ahead and remove this. So a little thrust washer. We have our outer pinion bearing here. Go ahead and put that there. We're now gonna remove our bearing races, bearing cups. You'll hear people refer to these as quite a few different things, but I call them the bearing races. This one we are gonna hammer from the inside out using a brass punch or a brass drift. Don't wanna use steel because we do not wanna damage our axle housing at all. So we're gonna hit this one from the inside out. I would definitely recommend getting one longer than this because I'm having a hard time getting in there with my hammer. This is gonna be fun. So I was having a real hard time with this short punch trying to get this outer pinion race out first. So I'm gonna try to get the inside one out first so it'll make it a little easier to remove this outer one. So, there we go. So definitely destroyed the baffle by doing that, but luckily we have a new baffle in our master install kit. With this removed, I'm gonna go ahead and throw this back on the pinion bearing just so we don't lose them. And then now I'm gonna try to hammer it out this way. This is the only way I could actually get this out with a short of a punch, by hitting the hammer on the head. So it's working, but. Got it. Now that we have a bare housing, our old carrier and ring gears removed, as well as our pinion and all the bearings, it's time to go ahead and assemble our new ring gear onto our locker or the carrier of your choosing. So I'm not going to show every single part of this step, but it's really important to file down any burrs that are on the backside of your ring gear as well as the carrier. So in this Yukon zip locker, it is a nice machine surface. There were no burrs, as well as on this Dana 60 ring gear from Yukon. The 14 bolt did have some burrs on the last video, but I just went through and it is nice and smooth. So it's time to install our ring gear onto our locker. Just like in the last video, make a little mark right along where the bolts are so you can look at it from a side angle and see where to line the ring gear up, just to get us close for now. And once again, it would definitely help if we put this in the oven and heated it up a little bit, but we're just gonna hammer it on. Finally got the ring gear mounted to the carrier. Now, since this is a new ring gear and a new carrier, the tolerances were really tight. What I actually ended up doing was cleaning off the ring gear really good, and I actually did put it in the oven. Set it about to 250, left it in there for, it was like 20 or 30 minutes till it was nice and warm, and I actually had the carrier in the freezer. Didn't really want to record all this because, like I said, don't want this to be a really long, boring video. But if you are installing a new carrier and a new ring gear, your tolerances are going to be really tight. But between freezing this and heating this up, turning it over, and I actually did give it a few taps with my mallet. It is okay to hit the ring gear. You just don't want to smash it. This is, you know, really, really hard metal. So, you know, a mild steel isn't going to damage it too bad. But we have it flipped over here. And now that it is nice and even all the way around, it is time to grab our new ring gear bolts included in the master install kit, grab our red Loctite, and put them on. We're going to torque these down on the Dana 60. It's 110 foot-pounds and a nice crisscross pattern until they are all torqued down. Got to be careful where we put this in the vise. Don't want to damage, you know, these where we're going to press our bearings on. So definitely be mindful where you clamp this down so we can torque it. But that's enough talking. I'm going to go ahead and install all of our ring gear bolts and torque them to spec. We're going to go ahead and take a little break from the carrier now that we have the ring gear installed. And we're going to take a look at our new pinion. So this pinion setup is going to be a little different than the factory setup. So on our old pinion, we actually had a shim underneath the bearing. Right here, it went on the pinion, and then the bearing pressed over on top of it. For now, we are going to keep this so we don't lose it. But with our new setup, we are going to use shims that go behind here on the housing. So we'll have to measure that later, but for now, we can go ahead and press on our pinion bearing. Now the Superduty does not use an oil slinger, and that's what I was trying to figure out yesterday. The master install kit comes with this slinger, and what that does usually is sit over the pinion just like this and slings oil throughout the housing to lubricate your bearings. I don't know why the Superduty doesn't use them. There's a lot of axles that don't use these. I think what it is something to do with low pinion front axles. However, our Superduty did not come with one, so we are not reinstalling one. But if you tear apart your axle and it does have that big slinger on it, definitely reinstall it. But what we're going to do is find our pinion bearing, make sure it's the same as this one, and we're going to go ahead and press this onto our pinion. When you press bearings on, you want to make sure we are pressing on the inside, not on the cage of this bearing, because that's how you mess up bearings. So we want to press right here in the middle. Luckily, the Yukon gear and axle bearing remover tool actually sits on here perfectly and pushes on the inside of this bearing. So let's bring this over to the press and press it on. Voila! Alright guys, now that we have our ring gear on our carrier, our inner pinion bearing pressed on, it's time to make setup bearings for our new pinion. So we have our old pinion and our own pinion bearings right here. I just had them sitting here, and what we are going to use is our big cup that we punched out through the diff cover and our outer pinion bearing. So there's only one of each of these. We're going to grab our old ones that we used from our old pinion, not the new ones. We're going to grab our Dremel and make setup bearings. What they are is they're going to allow us to slip them on and off really easy while we set up this axle. You don't want to just press all the new bearings on and then realize, oh, we need to add a shim somewhere, and then have to press all those bearings off and on and off and on. That's what these setup bearings do. Now on the cup, we are going to sand down the outside edge to make it easier to put in and out of the housing. We're not going to mess with the sides, only the outside diameter. Now on the actual bearing, this is the outer pinion bearing, we're going to hone out the inside so we can slide this on and off our pinion super easily. So we're going to use a Dremel, take a little bit off and test fit until it's nice and easy going on and off without too much play. And once again, make sure you're using your old bearings, not your new ones. I'll go ahead and say making these setup bearings sucks. This one, the actual pinion bearing, was not too bad. The Dremel did a really good job of honing that out, and as you can tell, we're going to go ahead and just slide that right on our old pinion. Definitely double check it on your new pinion, but I have that hidden away over there so it doesn't get disgusting. Man, my lens, speaking of disgusting, is covered in gear oil. It's very glary. So this one was done, easily done with the Dremel. Now this one, I actually had to finish it off with a grinder, just because it takes a lot to remove all this material. But what this is going to do is you're simply going to remove the material until you can slide it right inside there, inside our housing, where you can easily pull it back out and add shims. So that's good. One thing I will say is that after you're done grinding this, let it cool down for a minute, because if you've been grinding on this for, you know, a good 5 minutes, this is going to heat up a lot and expand, make it a lot harder to get in and out. So let it cool down, check it, and only remove as much as you need. But as you can tell, that's done. We are going to have to do this later for our old carrier bearings, but we are not to that step. So now that we have our setup bearings for our pinion ready to go, it's time to go ahead and install our bearing cup for right here. We're gonna make sure this is nice and cleaned out. We're gonna come over to our master install kit, grab our bearing cup. It's definitely a lot easier if we go ahead and put this in the freezer for a while, and it's gonna sit right inside there. Easiest way to install this outer pinion bearing is to put this in the freezer for a little while, and then grab some MAP gas and lightly heat up the housing. So as you can tell, I just put that in by hand. That is crazy. Even though it went in by hand, I'm gonna make sure it seats all the way. We're gonna grab our old bearing, a bearing driver, and a few good taps with a mallet. Now that we have our setup bearings made, we have our inner pinion bearing pressed on and our outer bearing cup pressed on inside the housing, it's time to start setting our pinion preload. Just like the 14 bolt, that's what we're going to do first. But we are also going to have to start off with some pinion depth shims, just to kind of gauge where we are. So, as you can tell, I have a bunch of stuff written down here, and this part can be a little tricky. This is what I'd recommend going online and reading a little bit about. But if you think about it and, you know, kind of think about the steps, it's really not that hard. So, we have our old pinion here, our old baffle, and of course the old shim that was on there. What we're gonna do is remove our shim, and we're gonna write down here under depth. So the lower shims, or the inner shims, are what control our pinion depth. The shims up here, or the crush sleeve, is what controls our pinion preload, or how tight, how hard it is to turn this pinion by hand. Controls how deep the bearings sit in their races. It either makes it harder to turn or lighter. But we'll get to that here in a minute. So first thing we're gonna do is write down depth, old inner shims. And that is gonna be the combined factor of our old baffle and whatever shims we had here underneath our bearing. So in my case, our old baffle was 16 thousandths and the shim was 41 thousandths. And that gives us 57 thousandths total, because we have to account for our old shim and our old baffle and our old shim. When you remove that bearing, your shim is gonna, or your old baffle is just gonna get destroyed like mine. So try to find a nice, anywhere flat to measure it. If you really can't, you can bend it back flat. And like this is all set up, so it doesn't have to be perfect. But this was 16 thousandths and this was 41 thousandths, this old shim, and that gave us 57 thousandths. So what we're gonna do now is measure our new baffle and write that down. My new baffle was 18 thousandths right here. So in order to make pretty much the same difference of the old shims, that was 57 thousandths, we subtract 57 thousandths from our new baffle, which is 18 thousandths, and that gives us 39 thousandths. So I went over here to our master install kit, and I grabbed 39 thousandths worth of shims. When you're doing this, try to measure each one individually and add it up. If you measure them all at once, it can be a few thousandths off, which isn't a big deal, but it's good practice to measure each shim separately. So let's talk about the orientation of these shims. We are gonna put our baffle inside the housing. So this little raised portion is facing this way. You want the raised portion to face the pinion. Now, put that in. Behind the baffle, or in front of the baffle, is gonna go the shims, and then our bearing cup that we're gonna put back in the housing. This is our setup cup. the one we honed out earlier. So that is it for the inner pinion shims, which is going to control our depth. And we're not really checking that yet. We're focusing on pinion preload, but we need something kind of close to be there. So as for pinion preload, as you can tell, the old pinion, see how it sits down here a lot lower than this new one? This used a crush sleeve, which is that what I talked about in the last video. It crushes down to set your pinion preload. If you crush it too low, you got to pop it off, put a new one on, and start over. This, just like a crush sleeve eliminator that we did in the 14 bolt, it actually uses shims to control pinion preload, which is sweet. So definitely take a look at your new versus old pinion. If they are the same height, you are going to have to reuse a crush sleeve. For example, if our new pinion was low like this, we'd have to use crush sleeves, which came in the kit. But our new pinion is designed for shims instead of a crush sleeve, so that's cool. Starting off for a shim pack, I'm just kind of wing it. I'm going to start with what I put down here. Start with 52 thousandths. We'll see how that goes, and if the pinion preload is too high, we'll have to add shims. If it's too low, we'll take away shims. So let's go ahead and throw this in the axle and start checking our pinion preload. Before we go ahead and check our pinion preload, we're going to put a little bit of gear oil on these bearings just so we're not getting a false reading from dry bearings. Doesn't take much. Definitely just put a little bit on there. That's going to be good for now. Let that sit in there. We're going to do the same with our outer pinion bearing. Just a nice little light coat. That one already has gear oil in there since it was the old bearing. But what we're going to do is grab our old baffle and shims and our setup bearing cup. Like I said, this is going to sit where the raised indention is facing into the axle. We're going to install our baffle first, right into the housing, then our shims, and then put our setup bearing cup in there. We're going to grab our pinion, slide it in, grab our setup bearing, put that over the pinion so it seats in the race. Grab our old thrust washer, put that right on top there. I guess I'll move the camera a little bit here so we can see what we're doing. And now we are going to put our yoke on. Grab our pinion washer, and we are not installing our pinion seal yet. That will add a little bit of resistance to our pinion preload. It's going to raise it, but we're going to be doing this a lot of times, so we don't want to damage that seal by taking it on and off. We're also going to use our old pinion nut. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and tighten this up and see what we are looking at and what our current pinion preload is. If we have a bunch of play, we'll have to remove some shims. If it gets way too tight, way too quick, we're going to have to add some shims. All right, let's go ahead and zap it on a little bit. So I can go ahead and tell right off the bat, I can barely even turn this pinion. So we have way too much preload, meaning we're going to have to add some shims. So let's go ahead and take this back off. Oh, I'm dumb. No wonder we had a lot. Oh man, so this is what sucks about making a video. I'm sitting here talking to you guys, and I forgot to put on the shims. No wonder our pinion preload was crazy high. So I never even put in the stack of 52 thousandths. So we need to put that on before we put our bearing on. There we go. And now put our bearing and thrust washer on. Wow. I was wondering, I'm like, man, that is crazy tight for my first try. We're gonna see a lot different. This is gonna be a lot different now. So yeah, this is what happens when you're trying to do a regear job and make a YouTube video. I swear I probably would have been done with this a couple days ago, but I know a lot of you people are really gonna benefit from this video, so I have no problem doing it. All right, now put our pinion nut on. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, dumb move on my part. All right, with 52 thousandths starting point, that's way too high. We're up in the 50s and 60s inch-pounds for our preload, which is too high. So we're gonna zap this off and I am still gonna add more shims to it. Definitely gotta check myself, because once this pinion nut or pinion yoke pops off, that pinion would have went flying to the ground. So I'm gonna flip it back this way. Added 10 thousandths to our shim pack, so we are at 62, 63 thousandths, and we are gonna see what that gives us. Set those over here to the side. I'm not gonna forget this time, hopefully. Let's try this again. All right, so this feels a lot better this time. It might be on the loose side, but we'll see. So we are using an inch-pound dial indicator with an adapter to go to the our big socket. But we are gonna measure the resistance it takes to turn this pinion. Not the initial, but the continuous torque it takes. So right now, we're a little bit on the high side. I'm reading right there. Like I said, make sure it's continuously spinning. Been messing around with this for a few minutes now, and I'm reading right around 20 something. Like I said, it's the continuous, not the initial startup. So right there, I'm sitting around 22, 23. Now the spec for the Dana 60 is 17 to 30 inch-pounds on new bearings. So we are nice in the middle of that range. However, since we're using setup bearings, using the old cone and the old bearing, when we put new bearings on, it's gonna raise our preload a little bit because they are tighter and they have closer tolerances. So with this setup, using our setup bearings, I'd like to get this honestly on the minimum side, right around 17 or 18, maybe even lower. I'd be fine around 16 to 17 with this old bearing setup. When we go back, once we're all done and throw our new bearings in there, plus the seal, that is gonna bump us up into the mid-20s, which is perfect for our new bearings. So I need to lower my pinion preload, which means I am going to add more shims. So right now I'm at 62 thousandths on the outer shims. And to lower it down a little bit, I'm probably going to bump it up to 65 thousandths. Really small increments make a huge difference. So let's go ahead and do the same thing we just did. Pop this all off, readjust our shims up to 65 thousandths, and then go from there. One thing I will say, guys, is that everything I'm doing here is going to be different for everybody. You can't just slap, you know, if I get a good pinion preload reading, you know, right at 20 inch-pounds, I'm getting a phone call. Let me finish this off. And I'm using 65 thousandths. Does not mean your setup is gonna be that. You're gonna have to mess with it and change it around, but hopefully you see what I'm saying. They're all different, but all the process to find all this stuff is exactly the same. All right, guys, one sec. All right, guys, so I got this pretty much dialed in right around 17 to 18 inch-pounds. So let me show you, I'm gonna try to show you. It's really hard to show this on the GoPro because it takes a nice continuous swing to get a good reading. And you really have to pay attention to what you're doing. So this is a cheap dial indicator, got off Amazon. I'll throw it in the link in the video description. It measures in inch-pounds and Newton meters, but we are in America. Sorry, Sir Isaac Newton. I think that's what Newton meters is based off, but we're going off inch-pounds. So like I was saying, it's not the initial torque it takes to turn the pinion. Like, see how it jumps up then drops back down. And it's also going to bounce around if you're doing an uneven swing. So let me turn the GoPro and try to do a nice even swing. And as you can tell, it's bouncing around 17, 18, and every time I stop, it jumps back up. But that is where we're going to set our pinion preload at for now, using 63 thousandths. And I mean, you can feel it's not a crazy amount of resistance. And like I said, once we put our new bearings and the new seals on, it's going to bump up, you know, between 20 and 30 inch-pounds. But that is set. It is time now to disassemble our old carrier. We're going to pull those bearings off, make those setup bearings, so hone the inside out, and start messing with our locker. So we're gonna have to press on these bearings, and before we start pressing on bearings, we're gonna have to take the old shim readings off our old carrier. So I actually have to head out to work soon, so once again, I'm gonna take a break and start this back up tonight. So that's the great thing about doing this swap, is that you can do a little bit here and there. It's nice if you can devote 6 hours at a time to do it, because you can make a lot of steps. You know, you're in the zone, you're moving. But that's the great thing about this build, is we can do it at our own pace. I've been out here for about an hour, got the pinion preload set, and I'll come back out here tonight and work on it more. It's not really interfering with my life. you know, an hour here and there isn't too bad, and we are saving a lot of money by doing this ourselves. And it's pretty fun to learn all this. I'm gonna, you know, this is a great skill to have. So I mean, even if you've never done this before, I'd recommend giving it a shot, but make sure you are very meticulous. Make sure you're checking every single step, double checking it, triple checking it. And of course, like I said in the last video, there's only one good outcome, or there's only one outcome. There's two outcomes, either good or bad. And of course, if it's good, it's gonna be within spec on everything. So that's enough talking. We will come back out here tonight and start working on our carrier and setting our backlash. All right, well, we have a very beautiful day out here to work on this project, and I am excited to finish this up and get these out of my garage, because as you can tell, it's kind of like taking over my garage. Got parts everywhere and a lot of other videos I need to make. So last night I started working on our carrier. The next step is setting backlash and carrier preload. So here's our old carrier, and as you can tell, I already removed one of the bearings. But how I found it was with a stack of shims underneath, the bearing pressed on, and then the bearing cup over there. So personally, I love the Yukon bearing remover tool. Makes it really easy. It is like 300 bucks, but if you plan on doing at least both these axles and possibly more in the future, it's definitely a great way. It's a great tool. It's almost needed for this job. Plus, once you're done, you can almost sell it. So I removed that bearing so I could go ahead and press on our new zip locker bearing. This bearing, I'm going to refer to ring gear side and pinion side when it comes to the carrier bearings. Ring gear side is closer to the ring gear, and the pinion side is where the pinion is going to sit over here. So on the pinion side, this is where the seal housing is, where it actually actuates the locker with air. There's a little hole somewhere over there. But we go ahead and press this bearing on without any shims underneath. So there's no need to make a setup bearing on this. We go ahead and press our new bearing from the master install kit right on there. Now, in order to do that, we are going to either need a pipe that fits over the carrier and on the inside of our bearing here, or we grab an old bearing, cut the cage off just with a pair of snips, and use that to press on our bearing. It fits perfectly on there around the carrier and onto the bearing. So definitely make sure you're pressing on these bearings correctly. And this was the bearing that was on our old carrier. So once we have this bearing removed, we are going to measure this stack of shims underneath the bearing. In my case, this is the pinion side, and it was 32 thousandths worth of shims. Make sure you're measuring them individually and not just a solid stack, because you will notice a difference. I measured all these out individually and added it up to 32 thousandths. If I sat here right now and added them up as a stack, it equals like 35 thousandths. So not a huge difference, but enough to kind of skew our numbers. So we still have to get our ring gear side carrier shim thickness, add them up, and get a total carrier shim stack thickness. And that's what we're going to use to set up this carrier preload, and then adjust from there to set our backlash. So let's flip this over, remove all this, and remove the other bearing, measure that shim stack, and then make setup bearing for that side so we can set our carrier up. Let's do it. And our bearing is safely removed. With our bearing removed and our shim stack calculated, we now have a total of 77 thousandths of shims. So it is time to make setup bearings, or just one setup bearing, for the ring gear side of our new zip locker. Once again, we are just going to hone out the inside of this bearing so we can slide it on and off easily to adjust our shims. So let's do it. Grind it out with the Dremel. Now that we have our setup bearing made, the inside honed out, it should be easy to slide in and off the carrier so we can adjust our shims. So I've actually been messing with this for a little bit so I could get a step forward and get some progress made. That way you guys aren't watching a super long video of me adjusting this 1,000 times. So what we did was measure our original carrier shims. On the ring gear side, it was 45 thousandths. The pinion side was 32 thousandths. And that gave us a total of 77 thousandths. And that's what we are going to start off with. Now I started off with that, and I had to slowly work my way up. Went up to 87 thousandths total. Needed more preload. So let's go to preload real quick. The only way to measure carrier bearing preload easily is to see how hard it is to go in the housing. If you don't have a case spreader, a couple hits with a rubber mallet will tell you. It should be really tight in there, pretty hard to get in. That's really the only way to measure your preload. There is another way where you don't set up any bearings and move the carrier all the way to one side, check it with the dial indicator, and push it all the way to the other. But that's more for setups that didn't have a carrier in there at all. Since we did have a carrier, we could start out with our starting shims. So I did, this is going to be really hard to explain. The minimum thickness for the seal housing side, or the pinion side on our zip locker, has to have a minimum of 15 thousandths of shims. So the shims on this side go over top the bearing, just like right here. And then our seal housing, which is where the air goes, sits on top of that. And you kind of gotta move the shims around just like that. It's gonna flop into our carrier. So this side's really easy to adjust. We just pull our seal housing off and add or subtract shims. But the first thing we're worried about is setting our carrier preload. So once we have that side, start off with a random amount of shims, you know, pretty close to the pinion side. So originally the pinion side had 32 thousandths of shims, and currently I'm up to 49 thousandths. So that's a huge difference because we're changing carriers. The tolerances are different, of course, they're machined different. And on the ring gear side, I am up to 43 thousandths, giving me a total shim stack of 92 thousandths. So let me go ahead and throw this in for you guys to show you what I'm talking about. This shim pack, which right now mine's at 43 thousandths, it's gonna go on there. We're gonna slide our setup bearing on. This is our old setup bearing that we drilled out and the new bearing cone. So we don't want to reuse the old bearing cone just because this might have a little bit of different tolerances. So we're going to put the new one on. And of course the other side has the new bearing and new bearing cone already. So we're going to go ahead and pick this up and try to flop it inside our housing and see how tight it is. Check our preload. And if the preload's good, we can go ahead and check our backlash. All right, it can be pretty tricky to get this in there. I just put my fingers inside of the carrier, get it lined up, and then I'm gonna count to 3 and drop it. 1, 2, 3. Whew. Definitely watch out for your fingers there. That is very, very heavy. You definitely don't want your fingers getting smashed in there. So it dropped in pretty easily since we have it vertical. We'll see how hard it is to pry out. But honestly, I still feel like we're a little bit low on the preload side. And we can also tell if we can move it back and forth on this locker. If you push it towards the ring gear side, you can see if you can move the seal housing. And as you can tell, it can move a little bit. So being able to move it side to side is telling me that our preload is a little bit on the small side, meaning we'll have to increase the total shim pack. So I can tell we do have a little bit of backlash, and that is how much this ring gear moves. I'll be quiet so you can hear it. Hear that little clunking? So on the Dana 60, our spec is between 6 and 10 thousandths. We can check that with our dial indicator. At this point, now that it's already in there, we might as well do an initial backlash check. I already know we're gonna have to increase our preload, so we're gonna have to do this again, but I am curious. So we're gonna rock the ring gear all the way down, set up our dial indicator, tap it, set it to 0, make sure there's a little bit of pressure on here already on this. You don't wanna set it so it's not touching. You set it so this plunger's already pushed in some, and then set it to 0. So now that we're at 0, we're gonna rock it forward and see how much this gauge moves. Do it back and forth, and hopefully you can see on the GoPro, but we are at about 5 thousandths of backlash, which is not enough. So now that we know we need to increase our preload and increase our backlash. To increase backlash, we are going to move our ring gear away from the pinion. And to increase preload, we are going to add shims. So we are going to have to add, I'm going to say 2 or 3 thousandths worth of shims for our preload, and we're gonna have to take away shims from our ring gear side and add them to our pinion side so it moves this ring gear over. It's really important that once we have our preload set, we don't change the total number of shims. So suppose our total number is 90 thousandths. Whenever we move our shims around to change our backlash, the total should always stay at 90. So if we take away 3 from here and add 3 to this side, Our backlash is going to change, but our pinion preload should stay the same. So hopefully you guys understand that. This is once again, watching a video might not be the easiest way to understand it. There's a lot of good info online about how to do these changes, but it's really simple. You're going to add shims on this side and subtract shims on this side to increase backlash. You're just increasing the distance where this is meshing, making it a little bit looser. So right now what I'm going to do is pull this back out, see how hard it is to pull out, increase our preload by adding shims, while at the same time adding shims to this side and taking a little bit away from this one. Now a general rule of thumb is to increase your backlash by 7 thousandths, you add 10 thousandths worth of shims. So I don't need to go up 7 thousandths, I only need to go up another 3, so I'm probably going to only add 5 thousandths to this side. But this is really hard to explain. Right now there's a lot of things going on. First off, our main goal is to get our preload set correctly, but we can almost do our backlash at the same time. So let's pull this out, mess with our shims again until we have a good backlash and a good preload. So yeah, preload is way off. That should not come out that easy. So I'm gonna add a lot more shims to this. Definitely be very careful when you're pulling this out. There we go. Grab it, put it on our bench. And we'll be back. Let's add some shims. All right, so I just added 5 thousandths worth of shims to our pinion side. So hopefully that's going to increase our backlash while giving us a better preload as well. So once again, slide it in there. Then 1, 2, 3. Ooh, that's scary. I am always afraid I'm going to drop that on my fingers. So we're going to make sure it's seated all the way in there. And we should have to hit this with a hammer. There we go, or a mallet, dead blow, whatever you have to get it seated all the way. Turn the ring gear a few times while we hit it. Ooh, be careful you don't hit. You gotta be very careful with bending this copper air line too many times. Not very good to break that. Luckily we could just call Yukon up and get another one. But I like this preload a lot better. As you could tell, it took a few good whacks of the hammer after dropping in to settle down. Now, for fun and giggles, we are going to check our backlash again real quick while we're here. All right, set it 0, rotate it forward, and that is beautiful. Right now we are at 7 thousandths backlash. And let me double check again, but I'm pretty sure the spec was 6 to 10 on backlash. 6 to 10, so 7 is within spec. So honestly, I think that right there might have got it. Our preload is pretty good in there. Now, before we double check our backlash, we are going to put our carrier bearing caps on, snug them down, and check it. Got the bearing caps on, and it turns out that we actually do not have to modify this bearing cap here. All you have to do is rock the seal housing up so it's right underneath the bolt hole and it has plenty of clearance. Easiest way to turn that once we have our carrier preload set is to get a little screwdriver and hit that notch with a hammer, and that turns the seal housing whichever way we want it. So it's buttoned up in here. We have them our carrier caps lightly torqued down, and it's time to check our backlash. All right, so let's rotate this back, set it to 0, and hopefully you can see. Now we're gonna rock it forward, and we are actually right at 6. So that is the minimum amount of backlash. I'll play around with it. I might bump it back up to 7 or 8, and once again, we do that by increasing shims on this side and decreasing shims on this side to move it away, but we're doing it in an even amount. So if I add 2 shims to this side, or 2 thousandths worth of shims, I need to take away 2 thousandths worth of shims on this side so we don't mess up our preload. But that is enough talking about backlash and preload. This is pretty good. I'm gonna mess around with it, see if I can't get this back up to 7 thousandths or 8 thousandths, and then from there button it back up, and we're gonna check our pattern, see if we have an acceptable pattern, and move our pinion in and out, and hopefully not our backlash again. But we'll talk about that here in a minute. I'm gonna mess around with this for a little bit, get it in a good spec, and then we're gonna check our gear pattern. All right, guys, I really want to stress again, to have a proper preload, you should not be able to pull this out by hand. You're gonna have to use a breaker bar to pop it out. Now, I am gonna increase my backlash a little bit. I'd rather be between 7 and 8 thousandths. I almost feel like I want to increase the preload a little bit, so it's, you know, takes about 8 taps to hit this in there. So what I'm gonna do is add about 2 thousandths or 3 thousandths to our pinion side, which is going to increase our backlash and increase our preload at the same time. Oh, had that bearing race go a little sideways, but went ahead and added 3 shims, and as you can tell, I like this preload a lot better. You really have to smack it in there for it to seat all the way. I'm happy with that. So with that added, we are going to reinstall our bearing caps and check our backlash once again. But at this point, I'm definitely calling my pinion preload set. If we ever have to take it off and change our backlash again, we are going to make sure that if we add any to one side, we are subtracting them from the other. So let me go ahead and move our seal housing. That's what I was talking about. We are just gonna lightly tap this guy and rotate it forward, making sure we're not dinging that copper airline. Got it back together, and our backlash is at 7 thousandths of an inch. That's right where I want it. But before we go any further, it's really important to check backlash in a few spots. Check it once, rotate the ring gear all the way around, and check it there. You want to make sure that you're not getting a bunch of different readings on different parts of the ring gear. It should be within 2 or 3 thousandths of the same reading. So right there, it is up a little bit. Actually, that's about right. That's still at 7 thousandths right there. And we're gonna check it at a minimum of 4 spots. If for some reason we're getting different readings across the board, that means that we have something that's a little bit wonky. Like if it's a difference of more than 2 or 3 thousandths on multiple spots of the ring gear, what you would do is once again make sure your bearing caps are torqued down so it's seated perfectly even. If you didn't clean off any burrs on the back of your ring gear, that could be throwing it off. Or what else could it be? You didn't torque down the ring gear evenly. Or for some reason, you just have something wrong. If you're getting more than 3 thousandths difference on the side of the ring gear, I'd reach out to the manufacturer, see what they have to say, and go from there. You can also measure the run out of the ring gear. I'm not going to do that because I don't need to, but you would put it sideways here and turn the ring gear around and see if you have any crazy run out on it. That would be an issue. But now that we have our backlash set and it's in spec, we are going to go ahead and paint the gears with some gear marking compound and see what our pattern looks like. All right, we're gonna mix up some of that yellow paint that came in the master install kit, mix it with a little bit of gear oil, and paint both the coast and drive side of about 3 or 4 gears. And we're gonna rotate our pinion. What we're gonna do is make sure we are creating a lot of drag so there's a good gear reading. There's a few different ways to do this. You could reinstall an axle shaft and have somebody hold it, or just put a lot of resistance so those gears are really meshing up with each other. All right, ran it through. We'll run it through again. So far, it doesn't look horrible. It is a little bit shallow, but we'll see. Run it through again. Nice resistance. All right, then we'll run it through the drive side. Once again, doing the same thing. Run it through again. Now that we have our gears marked and our pattern checked, looked through the book and found the one that best matched it, what I noticed is that the contact is pretty even between the tooth of the heel and toe, so right in the middle, but it is a little towards the top on both the drive and the coast side. You can see how it's sitting up towards the top of the gear. So what that means is that the pinion, as you can tell right there, pinion's too far away. Both of them, most likely, I'm looking at this one. They're hugging the top end of the gear. So what we're gonna do is move our pinion in a little bit closer. We're gonna have to pull our carrier out, undo our pinion nut, our yoke, all that. We're gonna save all these shims in the exact same space they are. And I am going to add probably 2/1000ths to that outer ring shim pack, the one that is in front of the baffle and behind our setup bearing. We're gonna rip it apart, add a little shim, put this all back together, and check it again. A lot of work. This is why we made setup bearings, so we can easily pull this off, add shims, and recheck it. Now, once we're done completely, we are gonna have to press in our new bearings and then do this all over again. It's a long, lengthy process. There's no doubt about that. So let me rip this all apart just to add like 2/1000ths worth of shims. That's crazy. Let's do it. Just got it set up for the second time. I added 2/1000ths to the pinion, which brought it closer to our ring gear. After I did that, put the pinion nut and everything back on. Once you do that, you have to check your pinion preload again, because that is subject to change. After I added those 2/1000ths worth of shims, my pinion preload went up a lot higher, so I had to add another shim on top of that to bring the pinion preload back down. Went ahead and put the carrier back in, rechecked our backlash. Luckily, the backlash stayed within spec. It did drop down a little bit, not too much, but we are still within spec. And second gear pattern is looking really nice. So this is our drive side, and as you can tell, it is nice and centered in there. It's hard to show you on the GoPro in this poor lighting, but it is centered, and on the coast side, it's looking the same. It's a little bit close out towards the outside of the tooth, but it is within spec, and I'm happy with this gear pattern. Now, it only took me 2 times. Luckily, Yukon gear, their ring and pinion gear sets usually line up pretty good and set up really easily. But there is a chance you would have to do this 10 or more times. You never really know how many times it's going to take to set up this gear set with an acceptable pattern. One thing I will say is that if you can't get a good gear pattern just by adjusting your pinion depth, that's when you're going to play with your backlash too. Move it over, open up your backlash, or close it down to really get a good acceptable gear pattern. So this step can be really frustrating because you're tearing this thing off on and off and on and off, and it really does take a long time. Luckily, second time, I'm good to go. So now that we know our pinion preload is set, our pinion depth is good, and our backlash is good, we are good to go and install our new bearings. However, before we do that, since we have our air locker here, we are going to have to drill and tap our air line hole right here through the housing. So in my case, I'm not sure if I'll have to grind a little bit of the truss away, but we're going to measure the inside thickness right here with our calipers and measure it on top. I might break out my grinder and just grind a little bit of this lip out here so we have enough room to tap it. So let's see, up in here, you're going to want to snake it around this bolt, and I'm going to have it come out right about here between these 2 holes, probably right about here on top. So we're going to take out our carrier, wrap up our pinion, make sure we don't get any metal shavings everywhere. Actually, we'll pull the pinion out. We'll have a bare housing, drill this hole, tap it, and install it according to the Yukon instruction books. Pretty easy. We're going to drill it out with a, I think 7/16, tap it with a 1/4 inch MPT tap, and then install the bulkhead fitting. And then put this all back together with our new bearings. All right, it's time to get some tap action. So normally you would put this in your little tap holder, but this is bigger than my holder. I don't know what that name is. So I found a socket that fits over here, and I actually have one of these little guys, like a socket ratchet, non-ratcheting thing. I don't know what this is called either, but it was in my toolbox, and I will make it work. So what we're gonna do is put it in there, and you slowly turn it clockwise. Nice and even, going in at the same angle that we had our drill bit. You'll feel it start to catch, and we're gonna do about a couple turns. And once we start getting a little bit of resistance, we're gonna back it out. I've done a few threads already. We're gonna back it out and kind of clean it out. Make sure the threads are catching. So it looks like it's doing pretty good. Go ahead and start threading this back in. we're pretty good to go. So we're gonna keep cranking on it. Thread a little bit, back it off. Thread a little bit, back it off. Probably gonna go grab some oil so we can oil this up and keep doing that. Bulkhead seal fitting is installed. Make sure to put a little Teflon tape on the thread so it seals it completely. You don't want gear oil shooting out of here. There's a little O-ring that sits down in there, and then this quick connect fitting. We're gonna go ahead and throw both those in there so we don't lose them. But we are good to go to reinstall our carrier and pinion. So we're gonna make sure that we press on our new bearing and have the shims behind it. Same shims that we've been using with our setup bearing, and we are good to go. That's pressed on. All we have left now to do is come inside our housing and pound our new bearing cup in. So before we actually do that, we'll want to put this baffle in and our shims that we've been using. Put those both in there and then install our new bearing cup. So I have mine in the freezer. I'm going to lightly heat the housing, put the baffle in, put the shims, and then put that bearing cup in and drive it in all the way until it's fully seated. We're carefully going to put our baffle and shims inside, trying not to burn ourselves because this is going to be hot. You don't want to overheat it like crazy. So just get it nice and warm, and then with the frozen bearing, this should go in pretty easy. Got our frozen bearing, let's see. Once again, slips right in. Now we're going to hammer that in, just make sure it's fully seated, let it cool down, and move on to the next step. With that race installed, we're now going to drop our pinion down in. We're going to leave these pinion shims, Pinion Preload shims. We're going to take those off so we make sure they don't fall onto the ground. We don't want to lose these. We're going to set them aside in a nice safe spot. And now we are going to reinstall our carrier. Seat it. And I am happy with that. That is a good amount of preload. That's cool. See how many times it took to hit that to fully seat it. Now you don't want to make it so you have to hit it for an hour, but this will be plenty. I'm gonna go ahead and move our seal housing over. Reinstall our bearing caps, torque them down. We're gonna grab our stack of preload shims and drop them right over onto the pinion. And then we have to get ready to press on our new outer pinion bearing. This is the one we use the setup bearing for, so it would slide easily on and off the shaft. Now that we have a new one, we're actually gonna have to drive it in. So what I'm gonna do is heat this up with some MAP gas on the inside, and then hopefully try to press it in. If not, we'll have to whack it in with the hammer. Alrighty, this bearing is hot. Looks like it's gonna slide in there pretty nice. I'm gonna grab the Yukon bearing removal tool once again to help hit this in. Go ahead and install the thrust washer, our yoke, and using our old pinion nut still, go ahead and tighten this up. And we're back to like step 3. So I just shut the camera off because I realized my pinion preload was way too high. So I just messed with the shims. I pulled everything apart, messed with the shims, threw our setup bearing back in there, and brought down with the setup bearing closer to 10 or 15. So hopefully when we reinstall the new bearing, it puts us up in that 17 to 30 pinion preload inch pounds. So we'll see about that. And then I also noticed that my backlash decreased a ton. I was down to about 3 thousandths of backlash. So what I have to do, since we already pressed on that new bearing, I'm gonna have to pull that bearing off with our Yukon removal tool, take away some of those shims, and then add the same amount to this side. So I'm probably gonna swap around probably about 3 thousandths over to this side and then take them away from that side. That way we can reinstall it put our new bearing in and check it all again and go from there. So that's the sucky thing about this swap, guys, is you're gonna have to do this a bunch, and you will need a bearing removal tool, something that we can remove our bearings with, change the shims, and then press it back on without damaging the bearing. So a lot of this I'm probably not going to record because time is crunching. I need to get this done, but I'm trying to explain it the best I can. So, you know, the setup, sometimes you throw it back together and it's perfect. Other times we are going to have to make adjustments. So yeah, I'm going to go change this carrier bearing, remove that, take away some shims, and luckily it's easy to add it to this seal housing side. Throw it back in, throw a new bearing back in the axle, and start over and check our pinion preload with the new shims in there, and hopefully we're good to go. But this is going to get repetitive, so I'll be back when we are done. Well, it looks like good things are coming. This is the first time I've put it back together with the new shims. Our preload on our pinion is perfect. It's right around 23, which is perfectly in between 17 and 30. Our carrier preload was going in good. Like I said, to increase the backlash, I added 4 shims on this side and took off 4 shims on this side. Put the bearings back on, drop this in, and we are checking our backlash. So I've checked it in 3 different places, and we are reading right around 9, which is on the high side. It's actually about 8.5. It's hard to see on this gauge, but it is a little bit on the high side, but it doesn't bother me too much because it's still within spec. So we'll check it again real quick. Right there, it's within spec, so I mean, we're good to go. So right around 8.5 backlash, I am calling that good, but we are not done. We are going to check our gear pattern one more time. If it's acceptable, we are calling this good, and we're going to wrap it up. We still have to route our airline through this tube. One thing I will say is I might have nicked it. I'm really not sure. When I was hammering this in, I hit the airline and it crushed against the side right here, so be careful. And honestly, what I would do is I would go ahead and order another seal, and the whole seal housing from Yukon, just to have in the future. So in a year from now, if somehow this seal starts leaking, we already have one in stock right on our shelves. We can just go ahead and change it out. It'd be really easy to change out here at home. We don't have to really do much of anything. Just throw the new seal on, make sure our backlash is still good, and go from there. I'm gonna run it. We'll see if it leaks or not, but we do still have to pull this out anyways to install the O-rings in there. So we still have a lot of work to go, but let's make sure that our gear pattern is good. And let's check it out. All right, so our drive side looks pretty good. You can tell that they're pretty much centered because you see how there's still yellow on the top of the tooth right there. If that paint was gone, we'd know that, you know, it wasn't centered inside the tooth. But honestly, I am happy with the drive side. Let's flip it over. And the coast side, I'm happy with that too. Hopefully you guys can see it on the GoPro. I'm calling that good. Definitely happy with that. So once again, I'm gonna rip this out to install our O-ring on our airline, the seal housing, and route it through here. It's pretty simple, guys. I mean, we're just gonna pull it off. There's 2 O-rings. Make sure you lube them up pretty good, throw them in there, and then when we route this, we're just gonna route it up and probably come down a little bit and up through there. We're gonna have to cut it. They say leave a ½ an inch above this little fitting right here. Sorry, let me wipe my lens. About ½ an inch above the fitting. You're gonna want a like a pipe cutter. You don't want to just snip this because it'll pinch it closed. Get the ones that you circle around it. Little pipe cutter or copper tubing cutter. That's what you're going to use to cut it. Otherwise, it's just gonna bend and kink itself when you cut it. So that's pretty much it, guys. I lucked out being the second time. You know, I used a lot of setup bearings and a lot of time setting it up, but sometimes after you finish up with the setup bearings and put all the new bearings on, you can have to do this, you know, 3 or 4 times. And one thing I'll stress is if, you know, something is not right, do not just call it good. Make sure it is within spec. If your backlash is 3 thousandths out of spec, that is not something you're going to want to run. Think about it, guys. Don't cheap out, you know, trying to save some time. This is not a weekend project for a beginner. This could definitely take about a week if this is your first time doing it. But I'm gonna go ahead and secure this up, and we'll do some last final checks, and then we still have to put on our new pinion seal, new pinion nut, and all that stuff. So we will be back, but we're almost done. All right, guys. Well, I officially jinxed myself. So earlier I was talking about it's a smart idea to go ahead and get an extra seal housing and an extra set of O-rings. Sadly, I misplaced my O-rings. I have no idea where they are. That is the last thing we need for this, and I don't have them. It's a Friday. I'm not going to be able to order them until Monday, so there's no telling when those are going to come in. So I'm glad this is happening now. I'm probably going to go ahead and order, another set of them too. So in the future, if, something ever happens with our O-rings or our seal housing goes bad and our air locker isn't working, we don't have to wait for shipping. We can just slap it in. So, I'm going to continue on without it, but I will have to break the carrier back out to put the O-rings inside the seal housing. So I'm not going to be able to route this airline yet and put it through here. I didn't mean to flick you guys off. But it's really, really easy. The instructions that come in the kit tell you exactly how to do it. That's a really, really easy part of this. There's really no reason to show you guys. And honestly, I want to get this video done because that is a moot point. But suppose we had our seal housing with our O-rings in, our airline, coming up through our bulkhead fitting. We would go ahead and zap off our yoke and everything again, and it's time to put in our new seal and new pinion nut and washer. So before we do this step, we'd want to verify everything once again, and I'm good to go. Our Pinion Preload was right around 25, which is perfect. Our backlash was in spec, and we have a good gear pattern. So now with all that done, I am tired and I'm ready to finish this up, even though I'm gonna have to come back later and install those O-rings. But we're gonna install our new pinion seal right here, lightly coat it with some grease and tap it in place. I'm gonna go ahead and put a little bit of gear oil on the inside lip. Slide our yoke on. The Dana 60 from the Superduty already uses a 1350 yoke. I will say that it does use strap style yokes, which aren't as strong as the U-bolt style. It's an upgrade you can do if you want, but I'm saving money, and honestly, I think the strap style is going to be plenty strong for my application with 40s and not too much horsepower. I don't see it being a big issue of blowing through these U-joints. However, not U-joints, the strap style yoke. So if that's something you do want to upgrade, you can get a replacement 1350 yoke with the U-bolt style. But for me, I'm just going to reuse this for now, save a little money. And honestly, in the future, it is a very easy upgrade if we want to switch it out. So we are going to go ahead and grab our new Pinion Nut Washer, lube it up a little bit, slide it on, and grab our red Loctite once we know everything is good. And this is going to be the last time we put this bad boy on. Put a good amount of red Loctite on there and on the threads. And it's time to go ahead and zap this down. We're also going to break out a torque wrench and make sure this is at least 225 foot-pounds. But let me go ahead and get it started with the impact. And we're good to go. Right there. It's the last thing we have to do. Just verify that this is actually torqued down. And our regear job is done. Well, guys, we are done. Technically, all I have to do is get the new O-rings for that, but really that's not a big deal. I'm really hoping that this video helped you out a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and say that do not just decide to regear your axles based on this video. I'll include a link in the description so you guys can read more about it. There's a lot of great info online, and I really stress doing your research and really, really making sure that you're confident and have the tools to do this job before you tackle it. Luckily, since we can have these axles sitting here on a bench for an undisclosed amount of time, you can really practice and get this right. You don't have to do it in a day. There's no rush. It might take you a week. It doesn't really matter since we are building these axles and there's no time crunch. However, if you're not confident in doing this, definitely pay a shop to do it. The 14 bolt is a lot easier to set up than the Dana 60. As you can tell, the 14 bolt uses those side adjusters, and the external or removable pinion makes it a lot easier to set up. That's a great teaching tool to set up that axle first and then coming over here to kind of understand what changes what and what steps you need to take in order to get a good outcome on a regear. So I'm going to stress it one more time. Make sure you want to tackle this and you have the time and skill before you actually do it. Everything's in spec. Make sure it's in spec before you call it good. And do not skimp on anything. If your backlash is out of spec and you've been working on this for 3 days, don't just call it good. It's gonna be a disaster on the road or trails if you skip something. But I know everybody's probably wondering, how much did all this cost? So, little parts breakdown. The zip locker, I've seen it anywhere online between $800 and $900. And a great thing about doing these axle swaps is that you can wait for holidays when companies are starting to run 10 or 15% off sales. So technically you could get an extra, 90 bucks off, whatever, free shipping. That's a great thing about this swap, is you can wait for good sales and get your parts discounted. So like I said, we'll just round that between 800 and 900. We'll call it 850 for the locker. The gears, once again, depends where you go through. I've seen them from 260 and 280. I went with the 538 Yukon gear and axle, thick cut gears because I did the 410 and down carrier. So we'll call that 270. And for the master install kit, $221. I'd really go with a nice install kit such as the Yukon. Reason being, they use the higher end bearings, the Timken bearings, where other master install kits use the Koyo bearings, which are still, I mean, they're plenty fine. It's a good place to cut cost if you have to. However, if you're looking for a great set of bearings that are going to last longer, I'd recommend going with the Yukon because they run the Timken bearings. That puts us at $1,340. So $1,340. You can get discounts if you shop around and if you order in bulk. So that's not much at all. $1,300 for gears and lockers. If we paid a shop to do this, we're looking at $2,000, if not more, a lot more. So we're definitely saving money by regearing both of our axles. And I will say another way to save money is to order both the front and rear both at the same time through a preferred vendor, somebody you trust. Personally, I like to order parts from Barnes and Off-Road Elements. Both those people will be able to help you out. They are a vendor for Yukon. And I think if you call them up and you're like, hey, I watched Ben's YouTube video on regearing axles, I'd like to get a sweet deal, I'm pretty sure they'd hook you up the best they could. So can't just give you guys a discount code. I have no idea if they'll be able to hook you up or not, but it's always worth a try. Especially, if you're ordering a bunch of stuff at once, you call up Barnes, like I said in my last video, and you say, hey, I want to order the swap truss kits, diff covers, some steering, and the Yukon gear and axle components, for locker and regear. All that combines to be a huge order. They're going to be able to cut out a bunch. They're going to be able to give you discounts probably everywhere across the board, which will be pretty cool. Same with Off-Road Elements. But that's about it, guys. I really hope this video helped you. I know it wasn't as far in depth as a 14-bolt video, but I didn't want this to last too long. And the thing with the front axle is there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts. It's not going to be the same for everybody. I said your preload's going to be different. So I just wanted you to see what this is like. Hopefully this video helps you. Like always, give this video a big thumbs up. Let me know what you think in the comments. And honestly, this regear is going to translate over to a lot of other axles. So like your Dana 44 front, your Dana 30 for you JK guys. A lot of this is very much the same, as well as the rear axle. So something to think about. Definitely do your research before you decide to regear yourself. But honestly, it's a job that can be done with a lot of research and practice. So thanks for watching, guys. Like always, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more videos. This was the biggest part of our 1-ton build. Got brakes sitting outside, steering's on the way, new diff covers on the way. We have a lot more to do, but this is probably the most feared aspect of this build, and we got it done. So stay tuned for the next video, and I can't wait to get these under the Jeep. Peace.